Okay, thanks, Mike. And I'm always pleased to talk with people, particularly those of a like mind, on Brexit. Although there clearly was the time before we had a global plague that we talked about nothing else, and clearly things have been eclipsed over the last year. But as Mike said, I've done the job leading on our Brexit brief since Keir took over as leader. Previously worked with Keir from 2016 as part of the Shadow Brexit team. And prior to that, I was Hilary Benn's PPS during the, when he was Shadow Foreign Secretary, and represented him on our ill-fated Labour Remain campaign. So it has kind of dominated my time in Parliament for the last 5 years. I mean, clearly, just kind of recapping on those 5 years, I mean, we campaigned to remain because we thought it was the right thing both for our country and the continent that we share. We lost that referendum by a painfully close margin, and there is some reflection to do at some stage when history books write up this period about how we contributed to that referendum defeat, probably not only by the way we ran the referendum campaign, but also by the way we failed to embrace a positive narrative about Europe in all those years we were in power. After the referendum, we clearly accepted the result and spent 5 years seeking to mitigate the damage. Before last December's disastrous election result, we were obviously pressing for a customs union which replicated the provisions that we enjoyed in the customs union with the European Union, for single market alignment, and for continued participation in the partnerships and agencies that we built together over 43 years. Clearly, last December's election changed everything. And since I took on the brief in April, what we were trying to do was to hold the Tories to account, not for what we wanted, because that had fallen by the wayside, but for what they had promised the British people and for what they'd signed up to in the political declaration. And that can be kind of summarised in 3 areas. One was barrier-free trade, one was a close security partnership, and one was guaranteeing the rights and protections that we'd enjoyed as members of the European Union. Now, clearly, the deal that we saw much later, I think, than any of us were expecting. I think, I never really doubted there was going to be a deal. Anything else was just too stupid. Occasionally I thought, well, maybe I'm making that assumption on the basis that we're dealing with rational actors here and this is Johnson. But I think I always thought there was going to be a deal. I never thought it was going to be announced on Christmas Eve. I always anticipated it would fall well short of the promises that the Tories made, and this one clearly does. And over the last few days, we've just seen how far short it falls. We've seen the problems on trade in and out of Northern Ireland. We've seen the wider problems of red tape at our borders, that import fees that are facing businesses, and particularly impacting on small businesses. We've had the ludicrous position where we now understand that privately, not to be quoted on it, but Department, and the Guardian ran a piece on it, that Department of International Trade officials are advising small businesses facing import-export problems to relocate part of their operation to Europe, losing jobs here, shifting jobs there, in order to avoid the friction that the deal creates at borders. We've seen the letdown even for the fishing industry. I mean, what was more totemic for Johnson than the constant narrative about the independent coastal nation, creating expectations which were always going to be betrayed, because there was never a deal to be done on Europe which met those expectations. And I'm hoping to speak later, although I'm quite well down on the call list, hoping to speak later in Parliament, on the proposals to scrap workers' rights. You know, all of those 4 years, the guarantees that we'd had from the Tories that workers' rights were safe in their hands. Now, clearly, we never believed them, but I have to say it's spectacular speed with which they have ditched their commitments on workers' rights and are now planning to dilute the provisions which were imposed on this country by Europe through the Working Time Directive. Now, you know, you'll all recognise that we had a bit of an internal debate within the parliamentary party about how we voted on that deal. It would have been a much more difficult debate had there been an up-down vote, and many of us would have found it very difficult to support the proposals in that context, but there wasn't. What we had was a future relationship bill, which was enabling legislation, simply providing the legislative framework within which a future relationship could be facilitated. But all of that is kind of history, and as Mike said, the real challenge that pro-Europeans face within the Labour Party now is what to do. And I think what we should be looking at is the two very clear commitments that Keir made. The first is that we should be seeking to hold the Tories to account for this deal for every day that they're in power. And many of us are seeking to do just that as it unravels before our eyes. And secondly, we should see the deal as a platform on which to build. And that echoes both union and business concerns. I met with a whole range of sector groups in business throughout the last 4 years, and particularly as we came close to concluding the deal in December. And at that late stage, I mean, they were all clear that they wanted a deal partly because anything was better than nothing, but they saw it as a platform on which to build, that the consequences of not having a deal would have been to have had such a poor relationship that they wouldn't have been in a position to do what they want to do, which is to spend the period ahead gradually, incrementally, trying to claw back to something closer to what we had in the past. And although the time we had to debate the future relationship bill on December the 30th was so outrageously truncated, it meant that we couldn't have full discussion around the amendments that we tabled. In a sense, those amendments that we tabled to the bill define the areas on which we should be focusing. Our first amendment was to commit the government to economic impact assessments twice a year, looking at the impact of the deal on trade in both goods and services. And we did that simply because we wanted to focus discussion on how the deal had let the economy down and had put people's jobs at risk. And it is worth, and I'm sure you're all only too aware, that although so much of the discussion around the deal was about trade in goods, trade in services was the critical area where the deal falls down. I mean, clearly on goods, we haven't got frictionless trade, but on services, we are facing a much more disadvantageous position because the deal doesn't touch on services. And that's not just financial services, hugely important that is the economy. It's not just legal services, but it's also many of the services that go with goods trade, the contracts to maintain equipment that's sold, and the ability for UK technicians and engineers to work across the continent. So that was the first area we looked at. The second was on security, and we were pushing for access to the Schengen Information System, SIS2, highlighting how much more our country, and it's fascinating how the Tories always talk about regaining control of our borders, but actually we have much less control of our borders now. We no longer have access to SIS2. But emphasising how the country's security was being put at risk, and that's the second area that we should be looking on. The third was about divergence on employment and environmental standards, which again should be a focus. And the fourth was about the issue of performers and artists' permits to work in the EU, something that's already been a big issue over the last couple of weeks. But that wasn't simply, in my mind, about that particular sector, but it opened up a debate about how we want Brits to be able to work across Europe going forward. And obviously anything that's agreed there has to be agreed on a reciprocal basis. I think that as things unfold, you know, when we get past the pandemic, and as our young people in particular begin to see a world in which it's no longer so easy for them to spend a little bit of time working in a Spanish bar or in a restaurant in Rome or wherever it is, there will be growing questions about the constraints on mobility within the deal. So those were our 4 key amendments. The other 3 were on participation in Erasmus, on accountability to Parliament, and on support and information for business. But I think they provide the framework through which we should look at the impact and look at where we want to build things going forward. I don't think that we should jump in and, you know, be saying now, well, we want a customs union, for example, to tackle the economic problems that we're facing. It may well be that as we begin to look at the impact on trade, and particularly trading goods, a conclusion we might come to would be that we wanted some sort of customs arrangement, which does begin to look something closer to what we had before. But I think it would be a mistake for those of us who are pro-Europeans to kind of fall into the denial narrative by simply asking for what we've always wanted, but rather to say, well, this is where we are, let's look at what we need, and let's begin to build a platform for what we want going forward. Probably, Mike, it makes sense if I stop there and open it up for discussion.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paul. That's a great summary, as always. So thank you again for that. So I'll just start with a couple of questions from me. And then if others have questions, if you could raise your hand using the participants tab, that would be great. Or if you'd rather type your question, you can put it in the chat. And we'll get through as many as we can. We've got a good chunk of time left to that, so that's great. But first question from me, Paul, as much as you feel comfortable answering it, is just about kind of Labour's electoral strategy at the moment. So it seems to me that, obviously, understandably, we had a horrendous election defeat in end of 2019. And in that election, we, of course, did lose a bunch of people who had formerly voted Labour, but had also voted Leave, and also a bunch of people who had voted Labour in the past, but also had voted Remain, kind of people going off in different directions to the Conservatives, or possibly the Brexit Party, and of course to the Lib Dems, and then in Scotland to the SNP as well. So obviously we need to win next time round. We need to not only get those voters back, but also indeed get more voters, or voters in the right places, than we had in 2017 when we also didn't win, and indeed 2015 and 2010 as well. So at the moment, it seems to me, and probably to quite a lot of people, that we're making a significant pitch for Leave voters in the red wall by not speaking up too loudly as we see the Brexit impacts beginning to appear. And I fully agree that we need to get voters back in the red wall. But it worries me that we're maybe letting Remainers go by not being seen to represent them. So I wondered if you had a thought on whether you thought that was the case, and if so, what you thought that maybe we should be doing as a party instead. Feel free to disagree.
No, I mean, I think you set out the kind of election challenge that we face, and I think it's, you know, let's be fair. It's although for those of us in the UK, it's exemplified by the Brexit challenge. It's a task for social democratic parties across Europe about how do we maintain a winning electoral coalition which secures our traditional base and that broader alliance which can deliver power in the way that it has in the past, not just for us, but for, you know, the once great Dutch Labour Party, the German Social Democrats, and in a sense, it's also the challenge that the Democrats face in the States. So it's kind of, as far as I'm concerned, part of a bigger challenge. I think that we've got to look at both those who, and I'm sorry, I'm conscious I'm probably repeating what you're saying, those who kind of came to us and delivered us seats that we wouldn't normally win, from Canterbury to Sheffield Hallam. We have got to win back in the so-called, and lots of people object to the term, red wall seats. We've also got to win in Scotland. And so there are kind of multiple challenges there. I think that what is central to winning people's confidence is a pitch which is authentic. And I don't think that we would be seen as authentic in either Canterbury or in the so-called red wall seats if we suddenly pretended we were something we weren't. And we are a party that campaigned to remain in the European Union because we believed in the European project. We are a party that campaigned to be in the European Union because we're internationalists. We are a party that campaigned in the European Union because we recognise our common history, common culture, and common values. We can't disown that. What we can do in relation to the red wall seats is not tell people they were wrong, because there were a multiplicity of factors which led to the way that people voted. But we can highlight how the promises they were made were broken, and actually how the Brexit project is not delivering the things that those who said it would told them it would in order to secure their vote. And I think that's really the heart of the challenge, and why it is important that we do hold the Tories to account on every day that they're in power for this deal.
Yeah, I agree with you there wholeheartedly. One more question from me, and then I'll move over to questions from everyone else. So if you do have one, pop your hand up or put it in the chat. Don't hold back. So next question for me is, I think I speak to a lot of Remainers or former Remainers who are adamant that they won't accept anything less than a jump straight back into EU membership, even though, of course, the road back to EU membership is not necessarily a straight one or an easy one, not least because the EU are unlikely to want to elect us as a member until both main parties are in favour. You know, there's no point Labour taking us back in if the Tories are at the same time, well, when we win the next election, we're going to take the UK straight out again. So it is potentially, depending how things work out, going to be a long road. So lots of other people are talking about the fact that we need building blocks that would have cross-party support, you know, which may be joining the customs union in the future, or the single market, or joining EFTA, you know, as a reach joining the EEA. So I don't know what thinking you've done on that, if any, or what thinking is going on in the party on that front.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, I think to talk about rejoining at this stage is nonsense. Apart from anything else, I mean, I don't sense, and I'm somebody who campaigned very hard to remain, and delighted my northern constituency delivered a 70% Remain vote, and I was bombarded with emails for a very long period of time by that group of people who, you know, at different times felt let down. Nobody's writing to me from that group now. And I do sense that there's not an appetite from anybody right now in the foreseeable future for a referendum on on renewed membership. And you're right, it would need a consensus which doesn't exist. And we would, I think, and Richard Corbett is on the call, will probably comment. It would. I think, you know, the EU 27 would need a lot of convincing before they wanted to reopen negotiations with Britain. There would need to be a significant change, and that's not likely in the immediate future. I think what we should be building the narrative, and I've looked at a lot of the polling that, in particular, Best for Britain have done, in red wall seats among Labour Tory switchers. And although there was an antipathy to the EU, clearly, because it drove people's decisions, there was an even greater antipathy to the United States, and a realignment there. And clearly there's no appetite for an alignment with China. In the world that we inhabit, and this is a difficult point to make sometimes, in the sort of people's perception of Britain, there are only three choices for an economy our size. You either align with Europe, or you align with the United States, or you align with China. We are going to continue to align with Europe. Now, there are some within the Brexit project who want to break that, who talk about joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and who actually, they talk about the Anglosphere. They want to break with Europe because they detest the European social model. They want us in a different position in the world. But in general, we're going to continue to align with Europe. The difference will be, and we're, our businesses are still going to be shaped by European standards. The difference will be we're no longer participating in setting those standards. We need to make the case that, and even Boris Johnson did in the announcement he made on Christmas Eve, that we are a country with a common history and common strategic interests, that our future lies with Europe. There will be opportunities, to renew partnerships, to rebuild relations. And so I think that we should begin to look at those opportunities to unfold. As I say, I think it's premature to be talking about, for example, customs union or specific formulations right now. Let's consolidate the narrative about our position as a European country who wants to succeed with the EU and needs the EU to succeed whether or not we're members, and to land that narrative and build from there.
Brilliant, thanks. How realistic is it, do you think, that we would join it's the TPP, isn't it, that the government will take us into? Is it realistic that they would want us as members? We're nowhere near the Pacific for obvious reasons.
There are apparently those who would want that. And the States, which isn't currently a member, there's some argument that even the States would want us in there. But I mean, let's cross that that issue when we come to it. I think that it's been posed by some of the Brexit ultras, those who really despise the European social model, almost as an alternative. I don't think we should get too hung up on it.
No, and it's of course nothing like the EU in full.
No, absolutely not.
Right, thank you for all of that. Really helpful. We'll come to Trevor, and then we'll come to Richard, and then meanwhile, I will have a look at some of the questions in the chat. So Trevor, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I want to take up something which you said earlier, Mike. We all, I think, want a Labour government. Now, you said in 3 years' time there'll be an election. In fact, it's 4 years' time, and Keir Starmer said this on the MAR programme on the 10th of January. Next election, in his view, is 2024. Now, the problem that Labour hasn't yet realised, it's a fact which goes right across the party, is everybody believes election is in December 2024. But the Conservative Party is repealing the Fixed Term Parliament Act, and the bill was published on December the 1st. And the reason why that's important is that they are going to go early. And I think, I've had a letter from my MP today. She's related to Jacob Rees-Mogg, but she wouldn't actually say when the bill will come to Parliament. But their plan is, it's been put on hold by the pandemic, you must go early, you mustn't wait until 2024 because there's going to be trouble. So the big point I would make is they will go early, or they'll try and go early. I mean, the Fixed Term Parliament Act will be repealed. Labour's in favour of doing that, so that's not the big issue. The big issue, the big message should be they're going to go early because there are problems. And that is what I'd like to see being put over to the ordinary person in the street.
Paul.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they want out of the straitjacket of the Fixed Term Parliament Act. They will get out of it. We don't know when. I think it'd be extremely unlikely that the next election will be December 2024. It might be earlier 2024. Polly Toynbee wrote a good piece in The Guardian arguing well that actually the optimum time for them to go would be 2022, after we kind of got through the pandemic. There was a good there's a good mood in the country, and before the economic consequences of the pandemic hit. Personally, I think that would be kind of risky, but you're right, Trevor. We should prepare for it to be earlier than December 2024, but who knows when.
Well, exactly. Thank you, Paul. Richard, go ahead.
Thanks, and hi, Paul. You asked me, Paul, what would be the EU's reaction if we did reapply to rejoin, and you're right that there would be some wariness, and it would, I think, depend on how decisive any decision looked. They don't want to go through this whole saga again, after all. But presumably, if we decided to apply to rejoin, it's something that politically would have had to have gone to a referendum, which would have had to have been won. And that would offer some guarantee, in which case they almost overwhelmingly would welcome us back, because we're part of Europe, because of interdependence, because it sends a signal to other countries that leaving is not a success. You come back with the tail between your legs, and so on. So I don't think that would be the obstacle. The obstacle, of course, is internal, nationally. What is going to be the state of public opinion? And frankly, we don't know. There are plenty of examples of public opinion shifting on issues which it was initially solidly behind. Look back at Suez, look back at Iraq. It's hard to find people nowadays who said, yeah, Iraq was a good idea, Suez was a good idea, but at the time, public opinion was really behind that. And it might shift on Brexit, it might not. But now is the time when it's quite likely to shift, given the multiple problems that are beginning to affect people's lives directly. And it's in our interest, I think, to talk up those problems and to thoroughly discredit Brexit so that it is seen as a national mistake that we made, that it was an error, that we were misled into it by Johnson and others, that it bears no resemblance to what was promised. And if public opinion is in that place, that opens the door at least to step by step, rejoin Erasmus and then start talking about the customs union or the single market, the security measures and so on, and possibly, depending on circumstances, to say we actually should rejoin. We should not rule that out as a party and as a Labour movement for Europe, Labour for European Future and so on. That's our role in a way, is to talk that up. Don't close the door to it. Don't say it's impossible. Say it depends on the public. We're democrats. If the public shifts, we should shift as well.
Thank you, Richard. Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right in the sense of not closing the door on anything. I think it's unreasonable to believe that there's going to, who would have expected everything we've seen in politics over the last 5 years, here and elsewhere. But I think it's unlikely that there's going to be such a substantial shift in public opinion that there will be an appetite to support a party which commits to a referendum on our membership of the European Union at the next election. So I think our challenge is, and I'm not in a sense disagreeing, Richard, our challenge is, as you say, to expose the Brexit deal for what it is, to make the case for our relationship with the European Union, which we haven't always done in the past successfully or effectively. Way before 2015, through those 43 years of membership, we were not good enough at making that case. And let's see how things fall out. But I think the immediate challenge is to hold them to account for this deal, get people to be questioning the promises that they were made, and let's see where the narrative shifts. And I don't think you and I are disagreeing on that.
Brilliant, thank you. So I've got a question in the chat. Ivor says, given the current polling and the fact that the Boundary Commission is about to effectively hand extra seats to the Conservatives, do we not need an electoral alliance with the Lib Dems for the next general election, possibly bolstered by a confidence and supply agreement with the SNP? So this is an idea which, of course, is it seems to be announced by somebody or other as a great new idea about every week on Twitter. And there may be merit to it, but Paul, I'd be interested to hear what you think. The best route is to obviously a Labour government, but also just any non-Conservative government in this country 2 or 3 years from now.
Well, I mean, this is way off the issue. But I mean, I'm an electoral reformer personally. I've chaired the Labour campaign for electoral reform for the last 4 years. Stepped down recently, but still a vice chair. I also founded with John Denham back in 2011 a group called Labour for Democracy, which was kind of looking at the possibilities for progressive pluralism. Didn't really take off. I think that it's very much a personal view, but I remember us having these discussions in 1992 about never being able to win again. And 5 years later, we had the 97 landslide. I think personally that the political conditions are different now. I think we should be exploring our relationship with other progressive parties. I think we should certainly be committing to electoral reform, but that's a very different debate.
It is, but in a way related, in the sense that I think those of us who are pro-European, not everybody, but I think we tend to also, part of that vision is wanting to be what we view as a kind of modern European country, in terms of the way that we run and in terms of our social model and standards and rights, and focus on people's well-being and so on and so forth. And part of that, of course, is having what we would view as a modern electoral system. And certainly I would be fully in favour of proportional representation, not least because it would make a majority Conservative government almost impossible. So that would be a good future for any of us to live in, I think.
If we'd had PR, we would still be a member of the European Union. If you kind of look at how the politics of that would have played out. I think the other lesson from the referendum is that when you give people binary choices, it's actually quite destructive. And the way that we impose binary choices in our electoral system, I don't think is good for our politics. And the inability that we had over the last 4 years to forge meaningful partnerships within Parliament across tribal divisions to actually deal with some of the Brexit challenges, that would have been dealt with very differently in a more mature democracy with a more diverse representation that PR would have brought. But anyway.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that in the end, that was one of the things, that the public objected to. And one of the reasons why they were so desperate, in the election to get Brexit, in their eyes, to get Brexit done, it was, we won't know because I don't think anybody's done the polling, but it seemed to me that it was as much or more about just making it stop, rather than a huge public desire to leave the European Union with a really hard Brexit, which I don't think realistically was there. I mean, Theresa May asked for the same thing in 2017 and the country said no, and that was a less harmful of Brexit as well. If others have questions, please post them in the chat or raise a hand, and you can go ahead and ask, and that would be great. I guess my next question, Paul, would be in terms of holding the government to account. Obviously, that needs to be done in Parliament, and it'd be great to hear from you about whether you think that the Labour Party is doing that to the degree that it needs to currently, or what you know of Labour's plans to do that perhaps more robustly in future. But also just more broadly, for those of us who are not in Parliament, what do you think is the best way for us to be holding the Conservatives to account now, and thinking about the next year, I guess, the run up to the next election?
Well, I mean, I stepped down from our front bench after after the at the end of last year, as we left the transition, because it seemed to me the role of Shadow Minister for EU negotiations, even though talks are going to go on in very many different forms going forward, didn't really need to stand. And I'm going to be making those cases from the backbenches, and I know many colleagues are as well. And so I can't share an insight into the front bench strategy at the moment. But I think we've begun to see many colleagues pick up on many of the issues that are going wrong. I mean, whether it's Sally McGovern on performers' rights, whether it's Andy MacDonald leading stuff on today on workers' rights, we need to be picking up on all of these issues. In terms of your role, there's a role as party members to make sure the debate doesn't go away within CLPs, but also within the organisations of which you're a part. The performers' rights stuff is being led by the Musicians' Union and by other organisations. As Brexit impacts on the other organisations of which you're a part, let's see voices raised.
Brilliant, thank you. Right, Colin, you've raised your hand. Go ahead. You're on mute, Colin. That classic Zoom phrase. Yep.
Okay, sorry about that. Question is, Starmer's position is usually explained in terms of just pragmatism and polling and fear of what might occur if Labour was to move to a more pro-European position. But the question is, are there actually people in Starmer's leadership or in his office or in influence on his office who are actually in favour of Brexit positively and see there's a positive case? Or is it entirely based upon, if the wind were to change in terms of public opinion, he would have no difficulty in switching over?
I don't think there's nobody I know in Keir's team who favours Brexit as such. I mean, I know there was that view within some who kind of associated with Blue Labour, and clearly there are others on sections of the left who've made that argument. There are also, the Graham Stringers and others of my colleagues, very small number in the parliamentary party. But I don't think anybody in Keir's team actually believes in Brexit as a project. I think that everything is about the considerations in terms of how we forge the coalition and the platform of policies which will enable us to win power. And that's the debate that those of us who are pro-Europeans within the Labour Party need to engage in.
Great, thank you, Paul. David Blackman next. You're on mute, David. So.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I have two questions. One is, how does the parliamentary party shadow for the front bench deal with Brexit matters now? Hilary Benn's committee is gone, as one understands it, and I don't know whether Labour had a chance really to protest. Who speaks on it? So my second question is, if I understand it right, we've still got we can pay into Horizon, and are there other parallels for that? But clearly we can't, we've lost out on Erasmus. Is anybody asking detailed questions about whether the Turing proposal is more than a sketch on the back of an envelope? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. I mean, on sorry, I've missed the first part of your question. Remind me, George.
Well, I can.
David, sorry.
How does the front bench?
Who speaks for Brexit? Right. Okay. Yeah. I think that we are waiting to see how the government configure things. I had fully expected the many aspects of the economic issues to shift from the Cabinet Office to the Department for International Trade, and that then Labour's front bench would have reflected that, I've no doubt. I think that because the government probably don't trust Liz Truss, and there's something you could agree with, they don't seem to be giving her the responsibility for, even though she leads the Department for International Trade, they don't seem to be giving her the responsibility for trade with our biggest and most important trading partner. And that seems to still be sitting with the Cabinet Office at the moment, and so will the brief. So Rachel will be leading on it, and Jack Dromey has joined that team, and I think Jack's talked to me about. We got kind of done bits of handover stuff, and he'll be doing work on it too. On the second point, you're right about Horizon. It almost surprised me actually, because it had seemed to me like a no-brainer that we should be part of the Horizon Europe, but it did seem as if that was coming off the rails towards the end of the negotiations because of the financial arrangements that were being suggested from the EU27. I mean, I don't blame the EU27 for what they were suggesting, because the previous situation was clearly untenable, where as a member of the EU, we had been, because of the quality of our universities, primarily, far and above the biggest net beneficiary of the Horizon programs. Now, clearly that was going to be untenable once we were no longer members of the EU. So there had been some tension around the financial arrangements, but I think that common sense of the benefits of collaboration, regardless of the fact that we will no longer be a net financial winner, kind of won through. So we are still in Horizon Europe, and that's a very good thing. I was surprised in a sense that they chose to not continue with Erasmus, and because it was, it's a much smaller project. The amount of money involved is not huge, and lots of people benefited from it. It may well be that it's kind of part of that thinking within the government, which doesn't like anything which has got Europe in its title. We're in this ludicrous situation where we have replaced the European health insurance card with a global health insurance card. The irony being that, the only change seems to be that Europe's out the title, and that it covers far fewer countries than the European health insurance card, and certainly nowhere outside of Europe. So there is this kind of phobia about stuff that's got Europe in the title. But they obviously have foolishly and sadly dropped Erasmus, and that was one of the changes we were trying to bring about to keep in the Erasmus program. The Shadow Education team is really on top of looking at the Turin proposals, which fall well short of what we might expect in a whole series of ways, not least that whereas Erasmus was an exchange program with students going both ways, hugely beneficial, that we were welcoming people into our country as well as sending our young people abroad, Turing at the moment doesn't. It is simply a program for placing UK students into other countries. But the education team are very much on top of that, David.
Thank you.
And sorry, the second point is, I do think that we should be looking at every opportunity for collaborative projects and making the case as Europeans for us to be part of them.
Very good.
Thank you, Paul. Right, Paul, I know you need to go in a minute, so we've just got time for one final question, if that's all right, from Guy Fraser. Go ahead, Guy. You'll need to unmute yourself.
You're still on mute, Right.
Okay, great. Paul, thank you very much for taking all these questions. Very interesting answers. Just a couple of things. I noticed that Rees-Mogg has tried is in the process of shutting down the Brexit Scrutiny Committee. I'm not quite clear as to whether that's already happened, but I'm not under the impression, again, that that's being very vigorously fought. And just to that point, I noticed that since Keir Starmer's been leader, the Conservative Party lead, which was 20 points ahead in the polls in May, has now dropped to 0, and if anything, they're lagging. And Boris Johnson's leadership is rumoured to be under some sort of, if not threat, then pressure because of that. Could we be reacting more aggressively to that? And if I'm trying to understand, why is Keir Starmer seeming to tread so softly, given that he's taken such a big lead off Boris, and given that Rees-Mogg has taken such a ludicrous position on trying to shut down further scrutiny?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't actually talked to Hillary, Ben, since the new year, and I haven't discussed with him the position regarding his committee being closed, which Rees-Mogg is doing. I mean, part of the problem we got on all of this stuff, this sort of stuff at the moment, is the ruthless way in which the Tories are using their 80-seat majority. And so our ability to thwart anything is quite limited. And the ability to develop a popular campaign around maintaining a select committee isn't as strong as some of the other issues that we're working on universal credit, on free school meals and so on. I mean, they are ruthless. I mean, the change in the way that they related to us since December, compared with previously, when, like, I think, you know, I've only been an MP since 2010, but you know, generally there is a working across parties, even when the government has a reasonable working majority, and not just in the more recent period. There's a kind of sense of wanting to build understanding, and if they put forward legislation that's got a bit of a problem in it, then you identify the problem, then you work together to solve it. This lot aren't working anything like that. They are opposing stuff that we put in, amendments that we put in bills, even when they make complete common sense and have enormous support on the Conservative side, simply because they do not want to compromise. They want to make concede no ground to Parliament and to MPs. So kind of challenging decisions like abolishing select committees is hard. And I think that, you know, we've got to look at how we build the discourse going forward. And I just think, and I'm sorry if I'm kind of boringly repeating it, I think we need to take what Keir said on Christmas Eve and be building on it at every opportunity. I'm certainly reminding my colleagues, and you know, we need the narrative in the wider party. We want to hold the government to account for this Brexit deal for every day that they're in power, and through that discourse, use every opportunity to build an alternative platform. I'm certainly making that point, others are. And now we are past the transition period in this new space, then let's look at the opportunities. Well, I have to say, I mean, it's really difficult to land stuff that isn't related to COVID at the moment.
Great, thank you. That's really interesting. I mean, just one brief follow-up question from me, then we'll let you go because I know you've got another meeting. You mentioned that the Conservatives are not, I mean, we're very aware on many fronts they're not behaving as normal, even normal Conservative governments do, in the way that they're being so, you know, obstructionist to, you know, as you say, even sensible amendments from other parties. Do you know of Tory MPs who are concerned about that and are concerned at that behaviour? I mean, or do you think they're all happy and they're just playing along? Like, I guess my question is, you know, are they unhappy, and what levels of disquiet are building this behaviour within the Conservative Party, as much as you know?
There are a number of people who are unhappy. They are a smaller number than there used to be, because Johnson purged them. You know, a lot of sensible voices in the Tory party were forced out before the December election and at the December election. But there remain some people, and you know, it's not, I wouldn't want to damage them by naming names, but there remain some people who are seriously concerned, you know, who feel like Chris Patten said the other day, that this is no longer a couple of weeks ago, this is no longer Johnson's not a Conservative, he's an English nationalist. That they don't like the tone of the way that politics is being done, and they're unhappy with the direction in which he's taking the party and the sort of electoral coalition that he's trying to build. So, George Osborne wrote a piece very much along those lines in the Standard recently, although there is a man scarred by David Cameron's failures. But yeah, there are people who remain unhappy, but they have been replaced. You know, some of those people that they've lost have been replaced by people who are pulling Johnson in the other direction. You know, the part of the way in which they have defeated UKIP is by assimilating them. And if you look at some of the newer 2017 and 2019 intake, you know, those are voices who would be just as comfortable in UKIP. And so it's a complex challenge for the Tory party too.